Hi, everyone. This is Rob. Um, I'd like to welcome everyone to the PASS Data Architecture virtual chapter. Today we have a real special guest, a friend of mine. I asked him the last time I saw him to come on here, and he said he would come on and give a presentation on backups and restores best practice. So thank you, Mike, for spending your the next hour with us, talking about one of the things that I love to talk about. Mike probably knows that, backup and restores. If you have any questions, you can obviously email me at rob at sqltigers. Um, excuse with me, or you can hit us up on Twitter. So upcoming architecture, sessions. So we have a lot of stuff coming up. We got PowerShell, DBA tools. We're going to have PowerShell session by Robert Kane, Rob Swell, and Tim Mitchell on temporal tables. If you'd like to speak for our chapter, just shoot me an email, and we'd love to have y'all join us anytime. If there's a topic, we'll schedule you in. So we'd really like to thank Nutanix today. They just decided to sponsor us again for a year. Thank you, Nutanix, for investing in PASS and the data architecture chapter. If you have some time, check out the bit.ly link at the bottom. It's bit.ly.SQL on Nutanix. And they have some great white papers there they can share with you on their product. Also, HVR is our new sponsor. Thank you, HVR. And if you have a chance, you can click on, you can check out their website, hvr-software.com. They are also a big sponsor of this group. They make these sessions possible. So thank you, HVR. PASS is going to have Summit, and it's going to be November the 6th through the 9th. So I hope to see you there. It's a great event. A lot of technical sessions, a lot of sessions on SQL, a lot of great sessions overall. So if you haven't been, I highly encourage it. If you've been, I'm sure it's something you would like to go back to. We have a special code right here. Please use it. It's the VGDISENKE code. It's going to save you $150 on your registration. Please use it. It helps our group. And in the past, they have actually enough people use it. I was able to give away a free registration to some lucky person. So if enough of y'all use it, I may get a free registration to give away. And we'll have a special session for everyone to sign up, and we'll just give it away. So I'm hoping we have enough. We'll just wait and see. The Passion Award. It's a really cool award. It's for someone that goes out of their way and helps the community. Nominations are open now. Just to be elected is kind of an honor. So if you know somebody who likes that's really helping the community, go to that web link at the bottom, nominate them. It's a great feeling to be to get this award, I'm sure. So thank y'all. Upcoming virtual group webinars, and you can see we're on the top of the list there, but no shortage of webinars. They're all free. You may want to check them out. And then you can see it's a long list. Upcoming SQL Saturdays. So these are the upcoming SQL Saturdays. We just had one here in Baton Rouge, and it was great. You go to them and you don't know what you expect, and it turns out a lot of times you're going to get a lot of great content, a lot of great sessions. The people that speak are just phenomenal. So I'd like to thank everyone that does SQL Saturdays, and check it out if you're like one of these areas. And that's it. So let me turn it over to Mike. Mike, you there?
I am, Rob, ready to go.
Okay, I'm switching over to you right now.
Excellent. Let me make sure I got the right screen showing.
And thank you again.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no problem, man. Hey, so can you see the screen now?
I see you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming out this afternoon or this morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. Spend about an hour talking about database backups and restores. This is kind of a cornerstone topic, obviously, for Rob and myself. Really, I think it should be, it's an important topic for any data professional out there, because really this is our last line of defense. And we'll talk more about this as we go through. I do want to echo a couple things that Rob talked about. First off, definitely want to recommend, if you guys have not been to the past summit that Rob was talking about, see if you can go. There's plenty of resources, plenty of materials on how to make business cases around it. It's a great event. Maybe you go to your user group, maybe you're just local, where you talk to a couple people who do database stuff, SQL Server stuff. Well, you go to the summit, there's a couple thousand people there that you can network with, talk with, basically enhance your network with and learn more about how SQL Server works. You're going to have immediate access to a lot of the guys out of Microsoft that work on SQL Server. So really highly recommend that. And yeah, check out that discount code that Rob shared, because saving money. With that, let's just go ahead and get started here. First off, a little bit of an introduction for myself. As Rob was saying, my name is Mike Fall. I work for a company called Rubrik. I have, this is something I built internally to share, and so I'm using our internal PowerPoint deck. So you're going to see a lot of the Rubrik branding, but don't worry, I'm not going to be pitching the product to you today. But Rubrik is a data protection platform, and I'm there to talk about SQL Server for them. On top of that, I'm a data platform MVP. I've been a SQL Server professional for, 18 years now, so I've been doing it for a while. If you have an interest, I blog about some stuff up at mikefall.net. And what you'll tend to see is a lot of automation, a lot of PowerShell, but also like backups and restores as well, because I'm a big fan of those. And that's really enough about me, right? The rest of this is, there's really two kind of main points we're going to be talking to today. We're going to be talking mostly about what sort of things should you be thinking about when you build out your backup strategy. When you start sitting down and saying, okay, when should I be taking my backups? What kind of backups should I be taking? How should I be configuring my recovery models in SQL Server? What are all the different things that I need to consider as a data professional when I'm building out my backup strategy? That's kind of the first thing. And then the second thing is, once you've built the strategy and you've put the code in place and you've got your backups running, then you should be taking steps to validate your backup strategy. I mean, it's managing backups and managing even restores is an ongoing process. It's not something that you just do and then walk away from. It should be continually checked on, continually validated, because it is a key cornerstone aspect of any business, right? If we think about it as DBAs, or I should just say data professionals in general, our first and foremost responsibility to the company is safeguarding the company's data. And that could be arguably the most important asset of any company today in the modern IT world, right? Because everything kind of comes back to managing your data, whether it's customer records, whether it's order transactions, whether it's, I don't know, even help desk tickets, whatever you have in your company that you're doing from a data perspective, you need to make sure it's protected and that you can recover in the event of a disaster or some other issue that might happen to cause your data to become unavailable. And really, that's what this all boils down to. So with that in mind, let's just go ahead and move into that first element and talk about, where do you start? How do you even know with a backup strategy, what you should be doing? Because it's very easy for somebody to sit down and say, well, I'm going to take full backups once a week, and then I'll take differential backups every other day of the week, and then I'll do my transaction log backups every 60 minutes to meet my requirements. And yeah, I'll put that in place and I'll have my jobs running. But the problem with just going in and starting to do stuff is you're you're doing what you see as a solution is necessary from a technical person's point of view. But at the end of the day, we got to remember that technology is simply a tool to solve business problems, right? Technology is just something that we as professionals will use to serve what the business needs. And really, at the end of the day, and that's why, like, as a technical person, I can't come in and tell somebody, you know, here's your solution, right? They have to tell me what they're trying to achieve. And then me as the technical professional will then turn around and say, okay, if this is your goal, here's what we need to do to meet that goal. And that's really the focus here, is you always have to remember, as a technical professional, when it comes to backups and restores, as really as with anything else in your day-to-day job, you're there to solve a business problem. So we need the business owners to work with us. Now, keep in mind with that sometimes the business owner may not understand all the technical implications of what they want. So then we have to sit back and say, okay, well, as in our role as a technical professional, here's what we would advise, here's what we would suggest, right? We can guide them to the appropriate solution. But at the end of the day, it's the business that should drive that. So then we can talk about what the business drivers really become. And it does come back to, it's funny, when you talk about a backup strategy, it's really not about backing up. It's about what do you need to restore? What do you need to recover? And then we'll build the backups around the sort of things that we need to actually, what kind of data we need to bring back, how accurate or how granular do we need that recovery to be. And again, this is what the business has to tell us, right? We, as a DBA, I can't go to somebody and say, oh, you need to be able to recover data within a 15-minute period, right? The business needs to come to me and say, you know, we can afford to lose up to 30 minutes worth of data, at which point then I can sit back and say, oh, okay, you know, I can build around that, but I can't be the one to make that decision. And it does come down to kind of these 3 bullet points that I have here, right? The service level agreements. What are the agreements between you and the business, or I should say the IT staff and the business, to say, this is what we can give you? And again, it can be a negotiation. They might come to you and say, hey, we can't afford to lose any data, or we need to have 0 downtime, or even 5 nines of uptime, or whatever they want to call it, right? And then, you know, you as the technical professional can say, okay, I understand that, but here's what we have to do to make that happen, right? But it still is going to be that conversation to kind of figure out what the service level agreements are, and you know, what we have to build around that. And it does focus on those last 2 bullet points of the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective. If you're not familiar with these terms, you know, this is something that should definitely be in your vocabulary as a data professional. RTO and RPO, and really are very simple. RPO is, to what point can I recover my data? Or another way to think of it is, how much data can I afford to lose? Right, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this practically comes into play when we set up our database backups. But really, there's always going to be a cost associated with how much data can I lose. Can it be sometime in the last 24 hours? Can it be sometime in the last 30 minutes? Can it be sometime in the last 5? Can I only lose up to 5 minutes of data? And again, we can't decide that. That has to be the business that decides that. And then secondly, the recovery time objective is, how long does it take me to do that, right? How long does it take me to get that? While I might be able to get all my data back in, you know, or get back to within 5 minutes of my failure point, I still need to be able to tell the business how long. Is that going to take me 2 hours? Is that going to take me 4 hours? You know, what's the amount of time? Because you're still going to be down in that time, right? You're still not going to, the data still will not be accessible. And then you have to talk about other situations, right? We'll get to this a little more in detail, but you know, what are the situations around, okay, maybe it's a complete emergency where it's a total site loss. Maybe you need to recover just 1 table out of your database. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to how this works, but ultimately, like I said, this is the conversation you should have with your business to say, here's what we need to define, and let the business tell you what they need. So again, high level stuff, more or less what you need. And then let's actually walk through how this is going to practically unfold when you start to sit down with the business. So say, for example, I have a transactional system that the business uses. It could be a credit card processing system. It could be some online ordering system. Regardless of what kind of system it is, we have this transactional system that is recording data. It's an online transaction processing system. And the business comes to us and says, okay, look, we can lose up to 10 minutes worth of data. If we lose something in the last 10 minutes, it's a wash. We can afford to lose that, and that's okay, but nothing more than 10 minutes. But then the business also says, okay, well, as far as retaining that data, and when we talk about the SLAs, the business says, okay, well, so after 2 weeks, within 2 weeks, we just need that data. We're going to need that data in case something goes wrong. But once we get beyond that 2-week period, then all we need to do is maybe have, a roll up of the data, or maybe only a weekly backup that we can use for auditing, but we don't need that fine level of granularity. They might also say, hey, but that auditing data, if we're going to maintain it, we do need to maintain it for a year. And then once it's, that auditing data is just going to be from the end of the month backup, right? Again, all these are the conversations that we're having with the business. And then ultimately they say, okay, and then if everything everything goes crazy, we need to be able to get back up within 4 hours of downtime, or within 4 hours. You can only have 4 hours worth of downtime. So then when I sit down and I'll figure this out as far as a backup strategy, it starts to unfold pretty straightforward, right? First off, I'm going to know that my databases are going to be in that full recovery model, right? I've got my full, I've got my bulk log, I've got my simple. And since I know I need point-in-time recovery to maintain that 10 minutes worth of backup, I'm going to say, okay, I want that full recovery model for my databases. And I know I'm going to need full database backups nightly. Now, depending on the volume of data, right, I might not be able to run the full backups. And this might come into saying, okay, well, I'll take a full every night and then have my differential. This comes more into, okay, how long does it take for me to run the backup? And then what do I need to do to bring that database back up? But at the end of the day, I need to have that kind of full data footprint every night to meet my SLAs. And of course, I need transaction log backups every 10 minutes. Again, somebody says to me, I can lose up to 10 minutes worth of data. The transaction log backups every 10 minutes is where this makes sense. I know I'm going to need to keep those transaction log backups for 14 days because the business has said to me, like, within that first 2-week period, that's where we need to, be able to recover to, have that coverage of getting that granularity. But then after the 2 weeks, it becomes that auditing data. So then we'll keep the transaction log backups for 14 days in addition to our full backups. And then I'll probably keep those nightly full backups for 1 month. I mean, I know after the 2-week period, I really only need the end of the month backup, as the business is telling me, but I'll probably want to give myself a little bit of coverage just to say, okay, we'll go ahead and keep those full backups, those daily full backups out through the month. And then ultimately that last month backup, then I'll go ahead and build out a retention policy, say, let's hold that for every year. Now, where you keep these backups, where they get stored, whether it's on disk, whether it's in some sort of backup system, that's ultimately fine detail that you would have to work out with your business as far as what kind of, storage you have and the different systems you have available to you. And a lot of that's just kind of details, right? It doesn't actually affect our overall backup strategy that we're going to approach this with. It just simply says, okay, it's where are we going to store the bits? We're still going to follow the same strategy, but some of those backups might go to some sort of offline storage, cold storage, what have you, because we don't have the online or the hot storage to keep it onto. And really, as you start to think through that too, that also becomes part of the conversation with the business. Say, okay, well, within the 2 weeks, because it's on the live storage, I can get you a very fast recovery time objective, right? I can get it up very quickly. But once we get beyond that 2 weeks and I have to send this to like colder storage, your audit data might take you a little longer to get back. Again, these are the sort of conversations that you would have around this. And again, this is just one example. Let's walk through a second example to kind of give you again how this would work out for a different sort of setup. Right, if I have a data warehouse system, somebody comes to me and says, okay, we got this data warehouse. I'm all right with losing up to a day's worth of data. In fact, some data warehouse systems, they'll actually come to you and say, I don't need backups at all because I'll just rebuild it from the source data. But that can have another impact, right? They might have a longer recovery time objective if I have to rebuild it from scratch. So maybe they just say, okay, well, I can lose up to 24 and rebuild the last day's worth of data from the source system. Again, data warehouse can be recreated from scratch, but it takes a long time. And if I want to meet into that recovery time objective, it makes sense for me to have some sort of backup strategy around it, but I don't maybe need to be as strict as the transaction processing system. We want to keep the data for about 6 months just in case. The system itself is going to have like its own aggregations and things going back through time. So when we get the daily backups, we'll keep that. But we'll just keep those daily backups maybe for 6 months, just in case we need to recover from something or we need to audit the data. And then again, have 24 hours worth of data time, downtime. This kind of comes back to the losing 24 hours worth of data. The data warehouse system may not be a critical business application. So the business says to me, hey, if that's down for a day, it's down for a day. Life goes on, we'll be all right, but we can take time bringing them back up. So then I sit back with the business and say, okay, here's how I see your backup strategy unfolding. So first off, simple recovery model is probably what we're going to use for the databases. We don't need that point in time granularity because anything within that 24-hour period, the business is going to be, okay, well, we can just recreate that from the source system. Again, I'll do those full database backups nightly. And again, just to caveat this, it might be a mix of fulls and differentials, but I want that full data footprint nightly. Now, how I get to that, it's going to break down again to how big the database is, how long it takes my backups to run. But again, full backups nightly is really what the end goal or the end state I'm trying to achieve. I don't need those transaction log backups, so I don't need to schedule that. And then I'll keep those nightly backups for 6 months. Now, that might be a little big of an ask, right, or a request, because that's a lot of storage that I might be going to my storage team and saying, hey, I need to keep daily backups for 6 months. But, maybe that's the cost of doing business. Maybe that is I go back and say, well, do we really need daily backups for 6 months? Maybe we go to weekly backups for 6 months. Maybe we go to monthly backups. That, again, comes down to what kind of storage and what kind of resources are available. And really, this is kind of how things unfold. The idea is having a conversation with the business, figuring out what their requirements are, and then coming back with, here's how I would technically implement that. I've been talking for a bit here, so I want to take a brief pause, see if there are any questions out there. It looks like we just had one come through. Let me see if I can get at this. What will so the question here looks like, I apologize, I'm trying to make the sense of the interface here. The question is, what will the backup and restore strategy be for databases with merge replication? So this really comes down to, again, what does the business require there? Obviously, using any level of SQL replication will complicate matters, right? So it's going to add some more considerations into how you're going to back up and restore your databases, because now I actually have to back up and restore multiple databases and then get my replication back in sync. So that's where you got to sit down and again talk to the business and say, okay, well, I can bring the main site up on within this period of time, but I might need some longer time to bring the other sites up. And that where it comes down to, maybe you start to think about merge replication. Maybe you say, okay, well, if I got to keep all these things in sync, and I need some other technology, maybe you look to something like storage replication, maybe you look to something like availability groups. But ultimately, it's just another kind of consideration. It is another layer of complexity that doesn't necessarily change the overall strategy, but just adds some other elements that you have to consider for that. See if there are any other, if there are any other questions, feel free to put them into the question interface.
I don't see any other for you, Mike. That was it.
Yeah, it looks like that's it. I might have to ask you to manage that, Rob, because I'm trying to read the question. Here, I can pop it up. There we go. There we go. Now I'm good now. I'm good now. Okay, cool. All right, so let's actually I think that's a great segue to the next section that I want to talk about, is you define out your backup strategy, right? And particularly when you start talking about replicating data to other locations, because commonly when you do that sort of data replication, this data distribution is meant for high availability. And one thing I always want to caution people when we start talking about high availability is not to confuse high availability with disaster recovery, right? These are actually two different things. And in many cases, database backups are there for disaster recovery, not necessarily to serve high availability. They can be combined into a high availability solution, things like log shipping and the like. But in a lot of times, high availability is simply meant to say, I want to make sure the database is available. And disaster recovery is, I want to make sure the database is recoverable in the event of a disaster. You know, some ways to be a little more specific about it is if we think about high availability is going to be reduced downtime, increased resilience, right? I'm going to be able to keep my database up and running. So things like failover clustering, availability groups, replication to a certain extent. Because my data is going to be distributed, I'm going to have multiple nodes to run my servers on, or my SQL servers on. It means that if I have a hardware failure or I have some other event that causes the database to go away, or my, to become inaccessible, I can run it in another location and my database will still be available at that point. So, but it's also, because of that, it's not backups. It's not long-term protection, right? Let's start to think about this in the sense of, let's say you got that disgruntled employee that comes in and says, hey, I'm not happy that I didn't get my raise and I'm going to quit. But before I quit, I'm going to go blow away the entire customer database because, I don't need it. I can, if they go in and run that delete query, as the guy's walking out the door, if I've got a high availability solution, I'm not really protecting against the loss of that data, am I, right? I'm protecting against the server being up and running so that they can come in and run their delete query. But if they delete it, that's going to replicate out through my environment and hit all my highly available stuff. So really you got to think about, okay, I can have this high availability solution to keep everything up and running, but I still need that long-term protection of the data, and that's where the disaster recovery stuff comes in, right? The disaster recovery solution is going to be something that protects your data and can provide you an audit trail, right? If something changes or somebody comes in and does, manipulation of the records that you may not be aware of, you're going to be able to see the history of your data that you can come back and look through that backup history. And I always like to think of it as it's the last line of defense. If all else fails, if everything else, I can have replication, I can have log shipping, I can use the storage snaps, I can use all these different technologies to make sure my data is available. But at the end of the day, if everything fails, if everything just goes to hell in a handbasket, my backups are going to be there as my final resort, as my last line of defense. So ultimately what this means is your disaster recovery is not high availability, it's your protection, it's your overall coverage to make sure everything is in place and that your data will be safeguarded. And that, again, just something to clarify as you start to think about the strategy and not to conflate the two terms of high availability and disaster recovery. With that, there is another question that came through. I'm going to answer that real quick. And it says, backup compression and disk tape backup dedupe, is one better? So as you start to think about this, right, basically it seems that the compressed backup cannot be deduped, thanks. So let's just talk about this as this is more of kind of a business impact, right? When I come to somebody and I say, I need to take backups on a certain period of time, right? And I'm usually going to have this conversation with the storage admin. They're going to say to me, well, yeah, but I only have X amount of space for you. So we need to be able to, make the best use of that space in order to make sure my backups are available to me to meet the business requirements. And there's a little bit of having the conversation with the business to say, look, if you want this backup strategy to be met, I'm going to need more storage. I'm going to need enough storage to meet your requirements. So now if we start to talk about compression and deduplication, these are usually mechanisms to improve the efficiency of how I store my backups on disk, right? I'm going to compress my backups down. I'm going to deduplicate the data to give myself more efficient use of the storage space. Now, if we start to think about comparing the two technologies, compression versus deduplication, the trick here is really at the end of the day, you talk a lot about technology and computers, right? It's usually ones and zeros. Well, with ones and zeros, right, there's usually only so much we can do. And compression and deduplication are both methods of reducing white space, reducing patterns in your data to more efficiently storage. It's actually, if you think about it, it's also the same as if I was going to zip up a file. And at some point when I've compressed or deduplicated data, I can't do it again. Running the process again isn't really going to give me a whole lot of benefit because I've already done it. Now, as far as a recommendation from my perspective, I tend to rely a lot more on backup compression than I do on deduplication, simply because it tends to be a little more efficient as far as restore speed. I mean, if I can deduplicate and compress, obviously I'm going to get a smaller footprint of data. But when I go to restore that, there's usually an unwinding of the deduplication and an unwinding of the compression. So if I'm just doing compression, it's usually faster on my restore. What I'm basically telling you after all this is, the both of them will work together. You're only going to get one level of efficiency because it's either going to, once you compress or dedupe the data, it can't be compressed or deduped any further beyond that. And then it comes down to, well, how much storage do you need and how fast do you need to do your RPO? So we'll talk about how you measure that out and whether it fits your strategy here in just a moment. Now, the question here, the next question is, how does TDE, how does that affect the restore time? So transparent data encryption, again, this is just another consideration and another step to your recovery process, right? So when you talk about I need to protect the data and it's transparently data encrypted, then I need to also protect a few other things, right? I need to protect my encryption certificates, and this just goes into my strategy. Maybe I need to back that up in one place. Maybe I need to back it up in another location because there's always kind of a separation of duties, making sure that my backups don't contain both my encryption keys and my backups, because that means if somebody gets my entire backup, they get everything, right? So sometimes you want to separate that. But really at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily affect the restore time. It's just another step that you would have to do and another thing you'll need to account in your strategy. All right, so with that, let's move on, because now we want to talk a little bit about, okay, great, we've built out the strategy. Building out the strategy is almost the easy part of this, right? There's a lot of things to consider, and you want to make sure you want to consider it, and it very much is the measure twice, cut once approach, right? You want to sit down and give your strategy enough consideration so that when you practically implement it, you're covering all the things. But the harder part is to make sure you're meeting that strategy as you move forward, as you're working on things, right? Now, what it ultimately boils down to me is I've got, what I call my 3 rules of recovery. And this is what I use, and I've used in the past to validate whether or not my backup strategy is working. The first is I need to know, is there actually a backup? You'll be surprised how many times you go in and you're like, you don't have a backup of something. So that's the first thing. If I don't have a backup, it's hard for me to recover from a backup if I don't have a backup, right? But so rule number 1 for me is, am I taking backups? And I'm always going to check to validate. I've got jobs and whatnot to ensure that my backups are being taken. But then the second thing is, is the backup accessible? And this starts to really come into an enterprise where, maybe I'll send the backup off to a file share, and then that file share is scraped by my backup admin and sent to the backup storage system, particularly for the longer term backups. Maybe I send it to a file share, but maybe my SQL account has permissions to write to the backup share, but personally I don't. So if I have to go make any other use of that, I can't get to the file share where the backups are. Or maybe the backup is written to a file share and then removed from that file share as part of the process, and I don't know where it goes after that. So it's very important as you think about your backups, when you go to do your recovery, can you get at the backup? Do you know where it is? Can you access it? Can you restore from it? And then the third thing here is, can you simply run the restore, right? Am I able to actually restore the backup? Using the TDE example, right? There's normally if I do a restore of a SQL database and I don't have anything else, it's a restore command and I just restore it to the server and life's good. But if it's a TDE database, then there's that extra piece of I have to recover the certificate. Can I get at the certificate? And then do I know what I need to do to restore that certificate and then restore the databases? So you need to be able to actually know what the process is to restore it and know that you can complete it. which we'll talk to a little bit more here in a bit. But really, these to me are the three things that as a DBA, I'm going to check off and say with my recovery strategy, can I do these three things? And it's not a simple one-time, hey, oh yeah, I did all three of these things, great, right? This is something you're going to need to do repeatedly to validate that your backup strategy is always working. And we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. Now, to answer the first question, we already have a couple tools in place for us, right? So first off, if you're not familiar with the MSDB DBO backup set table, I recommend you go check it out. This is one of my, if not my favorite system view, it's one of my favorite system views in SQL Server. Basically, all this is it's a table in SQL Server in the MSDB that records every single backup action, right? You can go in and query whether you're taking fulls, whether you're taking logs. Your successful backups are always going to be recorded in this. It's part of how Microsoft has built the backup commands to always do this. In fact, if you ever go and run some backup, some of the trace flags to see all the individual actions for backups, you'll actually see the moments where it writes to MSDB. And you want to check this again in accordance to your backup schedules. Validate, hey, do I have backups within this period of time? Are they being run when I want them to? But it's a great tool, and it's cool because it's baked directly into SQL Server, right? The other thing that you can use to validate this, and it actually rides on top of backup set, but if you've ever used policy-based management is a great tool that comes in SQL Server. I think it was included, it was introduced in 2008 or 2008 R2, that allows you to build out policies to check your backups. There's some great books out on this. Apologies, I did want to have a demo for this. I didn't have this one quite enough time to put this together. But really, you create a policy to go out and check to see, have my backups executed? You know, am I meeting these policies? Is everything all right? But these are tools amongst many others, right? I don't want to say that your validation of whether or not you took your backups is limited to just these things. There's a lot of different tools out there that can validate that. And then in addition to that, you know, you're going to need to just validate to say, okay, did it run without error? Did it land on the disk system? You know, all this stuff. But really, these are kind of the core places I would start with that are built right directly into SQL Server itself.
Hey, Mike, there's a question here for you.
Yeah,
basically, how often do you recommend or should test the restores?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to talk to that here in just a moment. So I kind of I'm glad we acknowledged the question, Rob, because it is an important question, and we're going to address that here very shortly. So that's why I hadn't answered it immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, no problem, no problem. All right, so the second question is, can I get to my backup, right? And this to me is the harder one to answer, right? Because in a lot of times we control the SQL Server, right? I can query the system views, I can run the policy-based management stuff. I usually, as the DBA, can have ready access to all this stuff and be able to jump in and use it and query it all. It's all, that stuff's always usually pretty easy for me. But the file system and where my backups land, that one can be a trickier one because usually I don't have control of it. Sometimes I do. Maybe if I'm writing my backups to a local file share, I might have direct control over that, but I'm probably not going to have control of it throughout my entire retention period. You know, at some point those backups would probably get written off to long-term storage, some other system. So it's very important for me as a DBA to go in and say, do I have permissions to access where my backups go? And that's just simply a matter of opening up, like logging into a machine as myself, opening up a Windows Explorer folder and going to where those backups are and just seeing, hey, can I get at the files, right? Also, I need to understand how those files are going to be removed or deleted. I mean, we're not going to keep everything on the file subsystem forever. That's just, unless you guys have a lot of money, maybe you do. Maybe you can keep your backups on a file system for months, if not years, but most businesses, they're going to be able to say, look, at some point, we're going to remove the backup files. So you need to understand how that process works and whether or not, okay, are the files going to be completely deleted without going anywhere else? Are they going to be copied to some other location? And if so, what is that other location, right? Where do I go to get the backups once they've moved off that immediate file share? These are, again, the things that you have to think about, that you have to consider as you're working with your backup system. And it does go to that second item there, is the backup storage. Once it goes off of the file shares, once it goes off that immediate landing zone for your backups, how do you get them back, right? Who do you need to talk to? Because usually the backup system is going to be administered by some other team, some other group. So you'll want to know who they are, who you can talk to. If you're having to file a help desk ticket with another team and you've never talked to them, it's going to make things a lot harder for you to get those back, particularly when the CTO is standing in your desk, standing at your desk, asking you when this backup is going to get restored. So make sure you know ahead of time who it is that you need to talk to, how do you get those files back, and how long does it take, right? Because that's going to affect your RPO, your recovery point objective, or I'm sorry, your recovery time objective, your RTO. You know, that's additional time you have to build into your strategy and understand how it works. Then the third thing here is the backup any good? And this is where you need to test your restores. Because I can take a backup, and it's even possible for me to back up a corrupted database or something that may not have my data in it. So what you need to do is, as your backups are being run, you need to validate, can I actually restore this backup? And the testing, it serves two purposes. One, you actually have to go through the process to know, do I know all the different steps to do my restore? And then secondly, you know, is this a backup that I can actually restore from? Then we want it, like, once we restore it, there's a couple things to do to validate it, right? To make sure that the restore is actually something we can use. And that's running a DBCC check against it, a check DB. This is always a great thing to do to make sure, did I take a good backup? Is my backup valid? And then you want to measure it. That's also the other important thing here is, you know, if you have a recovery time objective that you're committing to with the business, you need to understand how long does it take to complete each individual step to restore your database and meet those goals, and make sure that you're going to fit within the time window. The other thing it does, of course, is as you go through and test this, it lets you, and you measure what it takes to do each step. It also lets you know that when it comes to crunch time, you can go ahead and commit it. And this is where we'll go ahead and talk to that question that was just asked, right? Practicing your restores. So it's very important for you to go through those three items that we just talked to periodically. And what that period is, honestly, so this comes to the question of how often should you test the restores? I mean, I would say as often as possible. Absolutely as often as possible. Now, is that as often as possible? Is that once a week? Is that every day? Is that once a month? I mean, let's be real here. You know, there's a lot of other things that we have to do as data professionals. And if we spent our entire time, you know, doing backups and restores, you know, it's gonna certainly tell the company that, hey, you've got a reliable backup and restore strategy, but they probably want us doing some query tuning as well. Usually what makes sense, and what I've done in the past is I'll automate the process. I'll do some automated restore testing to validate the restores that runs on maybe a nightly basis, and it'll just randomly restore. I built the process typically to randomly restore one database, because I don't want to just like do a flood of restores, and usually didn't have the disk space to validate each individual restore every night. So I would do a random automated validation, but then I would do a monthly, I would sit down and actually walk through the steps myself. I love automation. I'm a huge scripter. I like to do a lot of this stuff, but at the end of the day, my automation might fail me. My scripts may not work. There may be something that prevents me. So I want to be able to actually go through every individual step manually. Again, that's kind of my last line of defense. That's my final kind of, when it all comes down to me. And so I need to make sure that I know personally that I can run the restore. I know I can get the file. I can get the file myself. I can copy to where I need to. I can restore it. I know all the appropriate commands and switches. And then at the end of the day, I know that once that completes, I'll have what I need, right? And that's where that second thing is you need to manually execute every step. Again, how often do you do it? How often can you do it? Can you do it every week? Can you do it every month? Whatever makes sense. Maybe if you're in a small enough shop where you have a small enough database, you know, maybe you start your day off just walking through the restore every morning. Certainly what I would say is if you're uncomfortable with it, like let's take TDE, for example. TDE is a little more complicated thing, right? Because I've got to restore my encryption certificate. I've got to then do the database restore. I've got to have all my keys set up. Maybe I do that I practice that every week for a month. And then after that, I'll just do it on a monthly basis once I get it under my belt. But practice, practice, practice. I mean, this is the old joke, right? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you know you're going to get your database restored enough times so the CTO is not mad at you? Practice, practice, practice. You can never practice your restores enough, in my opinion. And that's pretty much it, guys. I mean, this is more or less kind of a short and sweet presentation, just a lot of high-level stuff. These were the 2 items that we went to cover. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions or thoughts or comments. I don't know, Rob, is there anything you wanted to chime in from your experience around this?
No, I think it's a great thought about practice and baselining your restores. I think it's great. So you have a feel when you're in a situation that is really bad, you know what to expect, what you can tell people, so there are no unexpected surprises. So the practice is a great concept.
Yeah, and I think actually you mentioned something there, the baselining of restores. So one of the things I think we don't do enough as DBAs is often we're just kind of down in the trenches, doing our work, doing our jobs day-to-day basis, right? And people only see us when things go wrong and we swoop in to fix it, right? But they don't know necessarily what we're doing to make things go right. And testing your restores and baselining them and then reporting on those baselines is a great way for you to communicate back to your management what you're doing to ensure the security of their data estate, right? To let them know to say, hey, we sat down as a monthly exercise and did a restore of our biggest database to a test server, and here's the metrics around it. Here's what we saw. This is the amount of time. Maybe you even report on these were the problems we ran into and the things that maybe need to be addressed, right? It's a great way to get visibility to things before the things hit the fan, right? So really great comment there on the baselining.
We do have another question. It may not be, well, I'll just throw it out there.
Right.
It's really about best practices to speed up restores. Do you have any suggestions?
Best practices to speed up restores. So there's a lot of presentations. In fact, Rob, I think you might have done something on this about tuning backups, tuning restores, right? There's a lot of different switches and commands to the backup and the restore database and a lot of times those switches, they're very specific to an environment. So my recommendation to you is to maybe go out and do I do know Sean and Jen McCown have a really solid presentation on backup tuning. I think Bob Pasteri is another guy, and I'll see if I can assemble some links, Rob, to maybe to share out with folks here on the presentation. But ultimately, to the best practices, I don't know that there's any necessarily best practices other than to test the impact of those switches. And it comes back to practicing your restores. Maybe once you've practiced, your restores using the defaults, you sit down and you try some of the other switches and test and baseline those as well to know there are options for you. There's also another question here regarding scripts to testing restores. I do have some PowerShell scripts. I believe they're out on my blog. I will see about getting those links to send off to Rob to include as part of any sort of material he sends out as a follow-up for this. There's a lot of other folks out there who have built scripts for testing restores. Ultimately, what my automation did was it would restore the database, run a DBCC check against it, capture the output, and if there were any errors, email me. That's really the basic steps. And a lot of that, there's a lot of code out there that can be used for that.
That's all the questions I have see out there. Thank you, Mike, for coming on today. Great session. And
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, absolutely. I really appreciate everybody's time. Here's my contact information for folks out there. So this is my email address. Got my blog URL. If you are on Twitter, happy to, if you want to follow or communicate with me on Twitter. And then that last link is my GitHub link. Nothing in particular around this presentation out there, but if you're looking for just some of the things, scripting that I've done, other presentations, you're going to find a lot of material up there. And I think I might even have my automated database restore stuff up there. If I do, I'll try and find the specific links. But other than that, really appreciate the time today, guys, and thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Mike. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation as much as I did, and I look forward to seeing everyone next month. Thank you again. Bye.